For over 100 years, the Comanche moved through the West, and no one could stop them. Armies failed. Forts fell. Entire regions lived in fear. People vanished, and no one knew how or why. This isn't just something from the past, it's the kind of history people were too scared to write down. It all started with a mistake. The Spanish brought horses to America thinking they'd have a huge advantage. What they didn't expect was creating the most skilled horsemen the world had ever seen. The Comanche didn't just learn to ride, they became part of the horse itself. Within 3 generations, the Comanche went from walking everywhere to becoming mounted warriors who could do things on horseback that seemed impossible. These weren't weekend trail riders, they were turning their horses into 4-legged fighter jets. Children learned to ride before they could walk properly, spending entire days on horseback until sitting in a saddle felt more natural than sitting on the ground. A Comanche warrior could ride at full speed while hanging off the side of his horse, using the animal as a moving shield. At the same time, he'd be shooting arrows with deadly accuracy at targets he could barely see. They controlled their horses completely with their legs and body weight, keeping both hands free for weapons. While other riders needed reins to stay on their horses, the Comanche needed reins about as much as fish need bicycles. Their horses weren't just transportation, they were carefully selected weapons of war. The Comanche had a smart strategy: steal the fastest horses from settlements and military posts, then breed them for even more speed and stamina. Over the years, they built herds of horses that could outrun anything their enemies had. When raiders struck, everything happened in minutes. They'd appear on the horizon like a dust storm, hit their target with lightning speed, and vanish before anyone could organize a defense. Military cavalry trying to catch them was like watching a freight train chase a sports car. Technically, they were both moving, but only one had any hope of winning. The vast plains gave every advantage to the mounted warriors. While soldiers struggled with heavy equipment and rigid formations, Comanche riders moved like they were born in the saddle. They could wheel around enemy forces, attack from multiple directions, and disappear into the landscape before anyone could react. Speed was just the beginning of what made them impossible to stop. Most armies follow predictable patterns. They attack at certain times, avoid bad weather, and target obvious military objectives. The Comanche threw out the rulebook and made up their own game entirely. Raids happened at any time, anywhere, under any conditions. Dawn attacks were common, but so were midnight raids during thunderstorms when the noise covered their approach. While other warriors stayed home when it was raining, the Comanche used bad weather like a personal invisibility cloak. Winter raids caught everyone off guard because most people assumed nobody would be crazy enough to fight in a blizzard. Their targets made no sense to military minds. One day, they'd hit a single isolated cabin. The next day, a military fort, and the day after that, they'd steal an entire herd of cattle from a ranch. Small farms, big towns, mail carriers, trade caravans, everything was fair game. The Comanche were masters of misdirection. They'd send a small group to attack from one direction while the main force circled around from behind. Sometimes they'd leave obvious tracks leading east while the real raiders headed west. Military scouts would follow fake trails for days while the actual raiders were already back home counting their stolen horses. Communication made everything worse. When raiders hit a settlement, it took days or weeks for word to reach the nearest military post. By then, the attackers were hundreds of miles away, probably planning their next move. The uncertainty was almost as damaging as the actual raids. This chaos was made worse by something that confused military leaders even more. European armies were built around clear command structures. Defeat the general, capture the king, and the war is over. The Comanche had organized themselves completely differently, and it drove their enemies absolutely crazy. The Comanche were split into separate bands with names like Yamparica, Penateca, Noconi, Kotsoteca, and Quahati. Each band acted like its own small nation, with its own leaders, territory, and way of making decisions. No single chief controlled all the bands. Trying to find the head of the Comanche was like trying to find the boss of a thunderstorm. This created impossible problems for anyone trying to make peace. Military officials would spend months working out a treaty with one band, only to have a different band launch new raids the next week. Government representatives would wave signed treaties while arrows were still flying. It was like trying to negotiate with a swarm of bees by talking to just one of them. Killing or capturing leaders didn't solve the problem either. Comanche leadership was based on respect and ability, not bloodlines or official appointments. If a war chief died in battle, another skilled warrior would step up immediately. Asking who was in charge of all the Comanche was like asking which snowflake was the leader of winter. The bands could work together when they wanted to, but it was temporary and informal. 3 or 4 bands might join forces for a major raid, then split up again when it was over. This flexibility made them incredibly hard to predict or counter. Each band made its own decisions based on what they needed and what opportunities they saw. This decentralized structure was actually a huge advantage. While armies with rigid command structures could be paralyzed by losing key leaders, the Comanche kept functioning no matter what happened. But the real strength of the Comanche wasn't in their organization, it was in their culture. While most societies had some people who fought and others who didn't, the Comanche turned every man into a potential warrior. Boys grew up expecting to fight, and men stayed ready for battle until they were too old to ride. Training started in early childhood and never really stopped. Young boys learned to ride before they could properly walk. They practiced shooting arrows until they could hit moving targets from a galloping horse. Comanche childhood was like going to the world's most intense summer camp, except it lasted for years, and the activities could actually kill you. Hunting trips were really combat training in disguise. Chasing buffalo required the same skills used in battle: teamwork, timing, and nerves of steel. A boy who could bring down a charging buffalo with a single arrow would have no trouble handling an enemy soldier. This meant their fighting strength wasn't concentrated in a professional army that could be defeated in one big battle. Instead, it was spread among all the men in every band. When some were killed in battle, young men who had been training their whole lives quickly replaced them. Unlike professional soldiers who fought for money, Comanche warriors fought for honor and respect. Success in battle brought wealth, status, and the right to marry into important families. Being a successful warrior was like being a celebrity, professional athlete, and lottery winner all at the same time. This motivation made them incredibly hard to discourage. Every loss just made them more determined to succeed next time. The Comanche carried everything they needed on their horses and could replace their losses by stealing from their enemies. But fighting wasn't just about honor and skill for the Comanche. For the Comanche, raiding wasn't simple stealing. It was a complex economic system that kept their entire society running. They had created a way of life where successful warfare directly supported their survival and prosperity. Horses were the most valuable prize in any raid. A successful raid could bring back dozens or even hundreds of horses, which would be shared among the warriors, used for breeding, or traded with other tribes. The Comanche had become so good at stealing horses that they probably could have put professional horse thieves out of business. The goods captured during raids supplied the Comanche with everything they couldn't make themselves. Weapons, metal tools, cloth, and food all came from raiding. This meant they could keep their mobile lifestyle without having to settle down and become farmers. Why spend months growing corn when you could take it from someone who had already done the work? Trade networks spread the benefits of raiding far beyond Comanche territory. Horses stolen in Texas might be traded in New Mexico. Goods captured in Kansas could end up in Mexico. The Comanche had built a continent-wide trading system based on moving valuable items from one place to another. This economic system gave them several big advantages. They weren't tied to specific locations like farmers or townspeople. They could move their entire economy whenever they needed to avoid danger or find new opportunities. While their enemies were rooted in place like trees, the Comanche flowed across the landscape like water. Successful raids made both individuals and groups wealthier, creating strong incentives to keep fighting. The economic benefits meant that warfare actually increased Comanche resources instead of draining them. They had created a system where fighting made them stronger rather than weaker. This economic military system was perfectly suited to the enormous territory they controlled, but that vast space created its own set of challenges for anyone trying to stop them. The Comancheria stretched across parts of what are now Texas, Oklahoma, New Mexico, Colorado, and Kansas. This area was larger than the entire country of France, and every square mile was potentially dangerous territory for settlers and soldiers. The sheer size created impossible problems for anyone trying to provide protection. It was like trying to guard every house in a giant city with only a handful of police officers. Settlements were scattered across this vast area like tiny islands in a hostile ocean. Some were hundreds of miles from the nearest military post. Communication was painfully slow. By the time word of an attack reached the cavalry, the raiders had long since vanished into the endless plains. Reporting a Comanche raid was like trying to call the fire department about a fire that had already burned down 3 other buildings and moved to the next town. The open terrain of the Great Plains gave every possible advantage to mounted warriors. They could see enemies approaching from miles away, while their own movements were hidden by rolling hills and vast distances. Even fortified towns weren't completely safe. Military forces were stretched impossibly thin, trying to protect such an enormous area. A few thousand soldiers were expected to patrol and defend territory larger than most European countries. The psychological impact was enormous. People living in this territory never knew when they might face a raid. The vastness of the Comancheria meant that even when military forces managed to defeat one group of raiders, dozens of other bands were operating in different areas. The Comanche had created a climate of fear that covered an area larger than many modern countries. After a raid, warriors could disappear into canyons, river valleys, or simply into the endless grassland, leaving their pursuers chasing shadows across landscapes that seemed to stretch forever. The Comanche dominated the frontier through superior horsemanship, unpredictable tactics, decentralized leadership, warrior culture, economic warfare, and controlling vast territory that made traditional military responses completely ineffective.